Welcome to the Consummate Athlete Podcast, where we explore what it means to be a well-rounded, happy, goal-crushing athlete. Every week, myself, sports journalist Molly Herford, and cycling coach and kinesiologist Peter Glassford interview experts and chat through all of your training questions. We're excited to have you along for the ride. Hello. Welcome back to the Consummate Athlete Podcast. Peter, how's it going?
It's going well. We're into the heat of summer now. So the last couple of weeks, the weather's been improving, and now it's getting to that, this is actually like too hot in some cases.
Yeah. Quite hot.
Yeah, and I know that's going on around North America, certainly, and even into Europe. So lots of hot weather. I hope you're doing okay wherever you are. But we have a few great topics today. We have a Q&A. So again, thank you to those who have used either the Instagram sort of DMs or used our contact form or used the new anonymous question submission form as well, which we'll link in the show notes. You can find that in your podcast player and probably link from it, and certainly on the show notes on the website. But thank you for those questions.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess before we get into the main Q&A here, just kind of that reminder, like it is hot. So, I remember I was reminded of this weekend doing a couple of really hot, humid runs. Your perceived exertion is going to go up. Your speeds are probably going to go down. It's going to feel hard. You're probably going to struggle a little bit more with recovery. So, don't panic or assume that you're unfit during these weeks of heat wave here. Definitely, more water, more breaks, more electrolytes. Take care of yourself. If you feel off, drop it down a notch.
For sure. And this is when it's a good test of sort of how I've prepared them to sort of make decisions, because you're always making decisions whether it's hot or there's wildfire smoke or you're not feeling well or there's no hill or the hill's closed. You have to make all these decisions in training. And there's actually a big body of research around sort of decision-based training, I think is what it's called. Sort of even just, do I take the left line or the right line? Do you make all these decisions during your training and your racing, your competing, let alone your day? And so the better we can get at making decisions, the faster we can often, the better. And then we sort of see and we make it, we see how it goes, and then we get better over time at making better decisions or recovering from less good decisions. And so, as Molly's saying, with the heat, definitely this is a chance where I try and frame it as free training, and you can just go easier and maybe even train a bit less and get a quite good training effect in a lot of cases. But I was just composing an email before we got on here that you want to still do something. There's some people, especially we work with some people into their 50s and 60s, and they can be very heat sensitive. Everyone has different tolerance for this as well. And so you do want to be careful that you don't put yourself in a dangerous situation. But if we reduce the intensity of the training, or maybe the length of the training, or maybe both, maybe we get into a shadier area, maybe we train at different times of the day, you can usually customize this load a little bit to make it appropriate for where you're at with your heat adaptation and your fitness. But you do want to embrace it as a good training effect and just like a great thing to take advantage of.
For sure. Okay, and I'm sure we have a couple of episodes and articles on training in the heat, so maybe we'll link to a couple of those in the show notes. But let's get into the meat and potatoes of today, if you will. I love this first topic. Budget-friendly ways to do endurance sports. And yes, I'm pretty sure we do have a couple posts on this as well. And actually, it's kind of a section of our book, Becoming a Consummate Athlete. We do talk in the gear chapter a fair bit about, sort of thinking through when you do want to buy new gear, sort of the questions to ask. And, certainly right now, the economy is in a bit of a challenging spot. I think there's I'm seeing like really odd articles, to be honest, popping up where it's like, I guess it's on a couple of the sites I'm on that are more for, me to see if people need sources or like expert sources. And one of them was definitely like, I saw it just this morning, like, is your 4th of July party being affected by the uncertain economy? I'm like, I'm sorry, what 4th of July party was so over the top, like extra expensive that you're like, oh, nope, we're going Coors Light instead of craft beer this holiday season?
I guess it would be price of food is high and maybe some of those things that are coming, even from overseas for decorations. I could see it really being an inflated
I guess,
thing you
but
can take on.
That seems to be a bit of a stretch of an article.
As far as dire things, yeah. I mean, some people really like their holiday party, so.
However, that said, we were just talking the other day about, races aren't cheap. So sometimes, it is like a sticker price kind of shock when you look at the cost of doing races these days. Like, that is understandable. That is something we totally get.
For sure. I was going to just register for one the other day, and I said, that's a lot of money to put into this. So it is tough. And I mean, the running shoes cost $300 and the gels cost $300. There's just all this expense that goes into this stuff that we do, which is fine. No hobby makes sense. I've said that for a long time, that it's all irrational. Like, there's no investment strategy to doing a race. You're spending your money in a way that hopefully is spiraling out into a better life.
I was going to say, I think the investment strategy is that you're doing it in order to make like the health gains that come with signing up for a race, right? Like,
well, and again, when I say spiraling out, this is the idea of community and experience and seeing things and traveling and day-to-day motivation to get out and do more of those things. I would say the race day is less of the reason for doing it than the rationale for the 3 months of training and big rides you're going to do with friends. That's really why you're putting those things on the calendar and paying for them, I think. So if we're going to do them, then how can we make them more affordable?
Well, we talked about this actually when I had finished Leadville. We talked about this year was going to be very much a placemat year of racing, meaning that, we have this map, this placemat that is just kind of these local, sort of, you used to have the, if you can ride to it, you would do it. And you didn't actually have to ride to it. It was more just like a question of like, could you ride to it?
Mm-hmm. Within sort of an hour's drive would be the other way to sort of phrase it. You don't want to have to make hotel things and this sort of. So if you're fortunate enough to live within an hour's drive of enough races that's a season for you, it is sort of a nice way to constrain your choices and just say, okay, out of the 5 races I can do, I'm going to pick 3 of these because 2 I didn't like or they don't work with work and family. And then there's a season. Those are like your 3 major races. And not to say you wouldn't jump into a weekly race or something, a group ride or something like that. But those could be your 3 main races for the year. Yeah.
And I mean, I think this is like also the call to support local racing. I mean, we love a bucket list event. Obviously, like I'm, still very much pro Leadville. I wouldn't say no to Western States at this point, but I do think there is like a huge, huge value in racing locally and supporting those local promoters. So if I am putting out money right now, I would say I want to put it into our local, running, racing, cycling economy. I think the other budget friendly thing you can do if you're really tight, I think this is especially true of like for younger athletes or for parents with kids that are in sports that they can't, it's just pricey, is actually talking to the promoter of the league, whatever, and seeing what you can do if you volunteer your time or if you have someone else volunteer their time. So I know for me, when I was doing triathlon back in the day and had no money, I would volunteer my dad in exchange for either cheaper or free entry. And Dad actually loved it, right? Like he got to be at the race. He got to kind of be part of the race. He'd get a t-shirt. He'd get like the lunch afterwards. He got to really be like in the community, which he loved. And I got, cheaper entry. So even that kind of thing can really defray
I have
costs.
seen a few of those even volunteer this year and next year, or volunteer at this race, and then later in the year you can do one of the organizers' events. I think that's a great trade, and I still see those quite often now, if not more often. I really like that one.
Yeah. And then as far as gear goes, I do think, especially for some of these like specialized sports where you're talking about, you've never done a triathlon or a mountain bike race or, XYZ, or like you're not committed to doing the sport as a long-term thing. I think borrowing or renting gear is often severely underlooked. Now, obviously you can't borrow everything. Like there's some stuff I'm not borrowing a chamois from a friend. Sorry. Like I draw the line. Some people might not draw the line there. Totally fine. But like, borrowing a bike, borrowing shoes, borrowing a wetsuit. And obviously some of the stuff you have to have a friend that fits your size.
And most of those things have rental programs, I would imagine.
For sure.
Certainly I've seen wetsuit rental stuff.
Yeah, although the problem with that is sometimes like they're not rentals nearby, so you can't practice in the one that you're renting, and now it's race day. So there are some checks and balances there, like some pros and cons there.
But certainly even the used market, if not borrowing, is quite good.
Yeah, for sure. So definitely checking locally, even just asking around, because often someone has something lying around.
Well, we have 2 wetsuits that if someone wants to borrow or buy,
it's true, we
don't want a lot.
Actually, I think we have 3 because I have a really nice long sleeve one in addition to like the cheaper sleeveless one.
So yeah, that's it. I think the other thing I see, you mentioned kids, is just some of the stuff people have now is just the top end of the top end, and you don't need to do that. your XT or whatever the SRAM equivalent is, the mid-range is often quite good and really not that much different. A tiny bit more weight often, but most times that's completely okay for the goals we all have. Certainly that's how I've raced almost my whole career, is not on the absolute pinnacle bikes, but you'll see some folks end up on that, and you can see why that would get oppressive, and all of a sudden now they're counting money on their race entries or the trips they can do. And so to me, it was always that balance of get good enough that it's reliable and light enough, but then you want to leave some budget to actually go do the thing more often, not have to work to pay for your $15,000 bike.
Ooh, so I think that's actually one of like the best things I've always said. Like we do have a post on that where it's, are you buying time or are you buying gear? You can get the $400 race shoes, but if that means you have to go without, a few nights of like childcare where you could have gotten out and trained extra hours, or if that means you're working extra hours to get the shoes instead of, training, I would just much rather, race in my regular shoes and, maybe leave a couple minutes on the, of equipment gains behind,
Sure.
But at the sake of probably like, making up like 10 minutes in speed from actually adequately training.
Yep. And a few of those, if we're strictly talking about super shoes, there is a range of super shoes. Like some are down in the, I think, Decathlon branded ones, and that are actually, someone was just telling me the other day that actually are pretty good. I think it's, do you know the shoe company? I'm sorry for the shoe company, but I think they're sold at Decathlon, but they're not Decathlon shoes. It's like it's standalone brand. In any case, there are a range of things, as with bicycles and everything else, where you could shop around. The other thing I was thinking that is maybe obvious in this age of high carb fueling is the gels can be quite expensive as single purchase gels, but then there's also, you can get large bags, buy in bulk. This is apparent in most things in life. If you buy in bulk, people have their Costco memberships or whatever. But same as with the sugar powder, if you buy a larger kilogram or 4 kilogram, 5 kilogram bag of sugar powder, it's often cheaper than buying a single gel for $6. The whole bag might cost $60, and then you get a lot more use out of it.
For sure, yeah. And then there's the, other options of like making your own, the rice bars, the maple syrup, all of that, especially for, the more endurance-oriented rides where you can kind of experiment with other foods and stuff.
And I'm seeing this with the kids too, where it's the parents will buy. We see this at camp sometimes where it's they send them with 3 boxes of gels, and you're like, that's like $500 of gels they have.
Seriously.
Whereas again, most kids can digest anything you give them instantly.
Oh, for kids, go fruit snacks, like the cheap ones that you get that are like shaped like Scooby-Doo or Pop
or cookies or make your own or whatever. But there's lots of options there, and certainly most situations we don't have to, until we're really pushing the limits of endurance performance. That's what we're seeing in the studies, and this sort of thing is pushing the limits of endurance performance. But for a lot of us, most of the time, that's not what's going on.
For sure, yeah. And I mean, using up and wearing out your gear, I think, it's tempting every season when, Hoka comes out with their Speed Ghost 17s or whatever. Now you want the next one. And obviously, shoes do need to be replaced. Like clothes need to be replaced at some point. But I do think a lot of us replace before we need to, we'll say. Like, I finally got a couple new pairs of shorts this year, but now I'm good for like a few years, I think.
Right. It probably applies to things like bikes. It's easy to want to like get the latest and greatest, but usually you can use a bike for at least a few seasons before selling it. And there is a balance there often if you are trying to resell it, to keeping it in good enough shape and not letting it get so outdated that it's less, the tires have changed size all of a sudden and it's irrelevant.
Well, keeping in good shape is also a big part, I think, too, where it's, if you take care of your gear, like if you properly maintain your bike chain, that chain will last like 8 times as long as it would if you don't do anything to it.
Mm-hmm. Yep, for sure. You see that with people who don't do anything with their drivetrain and they just run it dirty all the time. And A, you're dropping performance that way, but B, your drivetrain is going to wear out really quickly versus if it's running really cleanly and there's not all that grit in there and you're keeping it well lubricated. That's a fantastic thought.
And okay, my last thing, in terms, I think of cycling. When we think about the budget stuff, you're like, okay, bikes are obviously just the biggest expense. I do think, it's tempting to go online and buy the D2C brands because they tend to be cheaper sticker price wise. That would be the budget thing to do on the surface. But the problem with a lot of the D2C brands is a lot of your local bike shops won't necessarily want to do maintenance on them, won't know the bikes super well, or, the bikes just arrive like kind of already clapped out. Like they need work on them just to be rideable. We've seen that happen a few times. Going to your local bike shop might cost a tiny bit more at the outset. But honestly, a lot of the time, I don't think it does. I think if you go to your local bike shop, especially right now with the state of cycling and like the honestly like glut of bikes in the bike shops and in the companies right now, I think they're willing to work with you. Like you can find some really good deals. You can probably honestly even figure out some, like, I know online you have all like the Klarna, like buy now, pay later, but I bet you a lot of local bike shops will figure.
Honestly, most credit cards have it built into them now to make things into payments.
So I do think, support your local bike shop when you can, because I actually do think you get better deals in the long run. Like if you buy a bike at the local bike shop, guess what? Like if you go in, you're gonna get better service on that bike. They're gonna like want to help you out with like little stuff that if you brought in a D2C bike, they're gonna charge you for.
Right.
So that's my take. Support your local bike shops.
Okay, and then maybe just part of our book and our ethos of Consummate Athlete is we do multiple sports, and so part of the thing we took in our book, Becoming a Consummate Athlete, which is actually, I think, having a resurgence. I'm seeing more and more people saying, oh, and I got your book, which is great. So
keep buying,
we will put the link in the show notes to our book, Becoming a Consummate Athlete. It's available on Amazon and not really at other bookstores. But
I mean, pretty much like anywhere books are sold, you can order it.
Oh, okay, there you go. You can go into your local bookshop and tell them to pull it in. Anyhow, we say one of the pack I've used for years and years now, the Chase vest, bike vest for hydration and all your snacks on your back, is a bike vest. So I've used it for bike races, but then it's for all of our running adventures. I still use it, even though it's looking sort of janky and getting sort of old and faded. It still works fantastic.
And has caused me to have to go into the woods to find your phone on like at least
No, that's my other one.
Oh.
My coaching Chase vest has an odd phone pocket, and it's probably more my fault than the Chase vest pocket, but it just zips a little differently, so the phone can eject out of the pocket. But
that's
for
a performance
this other one, just again, it works for running. So I could have bought many times over now running vest accessory things, but we've held off because it's not chafing. It seems to hold the water. It doesn't annoy me. So that's worked great. And so that piece cost maybe $100 or whatever it cost 5, 6, 7 years ago now. And then I've used it for running and biking. So it's just thinking about things like your raincoats, you don't need always the specialized run thing, or sorry, not specialized, but the customized, event specific equipment, especially when you get into these different sports. There is sort of this efficiency that when you get to that next sport, they call it scaffolding with skills. So if you've done this sport, sometimes you can scaffold over and you can do better at something. Instruments would be like this, where you can read music. So then when you go and take on a second, or languages might even be like that, where you scaffold that knowledge. So we can scaffold our gear over and say, okay, well, I have a raincoat and I have long tights for when I bike, and I put them over my spandex shorts when I'm biking. But when I run, I can just run with those same long tights when it gets cold. Or like socks. I have athletic socks that work for both sports. Or my beanie for when it's cold, it goes on my hat. Some might call it a toque, but it's a sports beanie. Gloves, winter gloves for cycling work for we use them for our cross country, even though they're not the coolest cross country skiing gloves, they work to grip a pole. So there's all these things that you can then scaffold over when you're doing other sports, which is a big part of our philosophy, but also maybe isn't apparent when you realize you're trying to outfit your kid to do, or yourself to do, cross country skiing, and you think you need the latest of the Norwegian craft cross country ski gear.
You can't afford it.
Right. Well, no, it's actually not bad. I like craft stuff, but it goes both ways in that you can use this stuff across. Like if it's cold and you need to cover your head, it's not that specific always. It doesn't have to be perfect.
Mm-hmm. I love it. And if you have any specific where you're like, okay, here is my situation, where would you save money? Definitely hit us up in the anonymous form, because I kind of love questions like that. I feel like it is kind of part of the fun puzzle of being in this weird world of endurance sports where there are so many options. Mm-hmm. I guess, okay. I swear, last one before we move on to the next question.
We both said last one. So
last one. I got a last one.
This is your PS.
PS. You also don't need to necessarily race to have big goals in endurance sport. I think that's what's really cool about it. Like look back to the pandemic, like we had everyone going after these FKTs, or, whether it was like an FKT, you were actually trying to get the fastest known time, or it was just a, adventure that you wanted to do for the sake of, being on that list of people who've attempted it. So I do think like, if you are, tight on budget in terms of like, okay, I can't, get to races or pay for races right now, and you have some of the gear, so like the gear is less of the issue, I do think, look at what's around you in terms of these adventure things you can add to your schedule and like put them on your calendar like they're races. Mm-hmm. And that's a much lower cost, option.
Sure.
So there we go. Okay. Next question. Ooh, I like this. Improving uphill running or riding. Ooh, do it. Do it a lot. Keep doing it.
It's sort of a perennial question of, I can't climb well. How do I get better at climbing? So this is it's a tricky question. But yeah, maybe we can hash through it. I think we have an article coming out more for running this week, if I'm not mistaken, or next week. I think we have a running uphill and then a running downhill one coming out in the next 2 weeks. So you can check that out on consummateathlete.com. So what do you think? Have you gotten better at hills?
Yeah, by being forced to do them. That's pretty much it. Like that's, I think, the only, okay. So generally speaking, like fitness does play a role in it, whether it's fitness on the flats or fitness on the hills. Like fitness is going to make running easier or running uphill easier, right. Or riding uphill easier. Just bigger engine equals it's going to be easier than smaller engine. But no, doing them is really the only way you can get better at them. Like, I think there's some mental gains, but I think for the most part, it's reps, right? Like we were lucky enough, we were staying with friends in Laguna Beach for a couple weeks there back in March, early April. And they were just on top of a hill. So, and to run either direction, you basically had to go down to sea level and then you were climbing back up the 300 meters to their place. So you kind of didn't have a choice but to do a few hundred meters of climbing every single time you went out for a run or a ride. And I would say that was the best 2 weeks of training that I had.
Sure.
Like, I think that was, it's funny when I was out on a run this weekend with some friends, they had all been at Sulphur Springs and they were all like, wait, you're telling me you actually ran up Martin Road every lap? And I was like, yeah, that's it. And like, I'm not a good climber, but I'm a determined climber,
right,
I think.
Right. Some of it is a choice. Like, I think there is that, like, I'm going to try and keep running, but there is a requisite fitness that comes into that. At some point, you can't turn your pedals or your feet can't go over when the gradient gets too steep for your fitness. There's just the amount of power that has to be put out through your pedals or through your feet. It just isn't there. So that is, I think, your initial point, that there's sort of this, you could say, threshold or whatever you want to use as your fitness has to be at a certain level. So the more you can ride, I always say, like, the volume and the frequency, and where a lot of times when this question comes in, it's sort of a frequency consistency thing. There's big gaps in training. There's multiple days in a row without training. And so one of the best things to initially do to increase your fitness is to train more frequently and consistently across the week. So this is where someone goes from 3 bike rides or runs a week, they get to 4, 5, 6 in a week. Once you get to that 5 or 6 in a week, then it's less clear. You could probably say then it's volume. You have to get more time on your feet or time with your butt in the saddle. And that can't all be intensity. It shouldn't be, right? This is the 80-20. This is polarized training. This is the idea that, like, a lot of the training should be easier. So the counter or paradoxical thing is that you actually aren't riding hills to do that. You're just putting more time in. So a bunch of it will need to be on the flats. And I think where e-bikes for a lot of people, especially if they're coming from a lower amount, like if your threshold sounds like in the hundreds, it's just hard to go up hills, especially off-road, when your threshold is in the hundreds, like under 200 watts. Like, it's very quickly you end up at 200 watts, which this is an absolute number. It's not true for every body and every person, but it's very hard to go uphill when your threshold, the power you can hold for an extended period of time, is under 200 roughly.
I'm going to make like a slight, asterisk on that. Like, I think that's really kind of assuming you're at least like a 150-pound person.
Right.
I do think when you're a little lighter than that, like...
For sure. And so, like, yes, most women, this is like, they're going to be in that around 200 watts or somewhere in there, right? I don't want to say there's a whole range of people in the world and they solve the problem. But it's going to be like, if you're noticing that on the hills, this is harder, that's part of it, right? And so what can you do? Well, often you can train more and train more consistently and then try and add some volume. And then what I often see is once someone's adding the volume, then this is where we can talk more about the intensity. And when we get to the hills, that's the important thing. So Molly said, on the weekends, try and get to hillier destinations. If you're someone who's asking this question, often it means, not always, but often, that you don't go to hilly places because you have it in, you've decided you're not good at hills. The hills are too hard. You just don't like it. It's not what you're good at. So you often might stay more to the flat terrain. You avoid the mountains. So on the weekends, you have to go out and do the weeds. That can be structured or not. It probably just can be a hilly run, but you could also try and set a goal for like how much you're accumulating elevation gain, ascent. So that would be another thing. Rather than tracking your distance or your time, is now you on those weekend runs or bikes, you're trying to say, okay, this weekend I'm going to see if I can do 600 meters in this workout. Next weekend, 700. Next weekend, 900. Next weekend, 1,000. And then over a while, we can start saying, okay, can you do that in under 3 hours or under 2.5 hours? Can you still accumulate 800 meters? So that would be the weekend. And very quickly, that'll start looking like a tempo workout or something that's more moderate. During the week, this would be you do strides or hill intervals. So this is something like a 30-second where you run like an athlete up a hill quite vigorously for you. And you get used to that sort of fast turnover and the neuromuscular power, the sprint, the anaerobic, whatever you want to call it. You would want that a little bit in the week. And that probably fills out the week, honestly, for most people. But that would be where you might also include some VO2. So you might do a bit of that combined with something like a hill interval, like what you might consider more of like a hill interval too. But it sort of depends a bit on the year and the person and the type of hills we're getting ready for. But that would be sort of the speed. You want the really fast stuff and then just the obvious, like, like you should spend more time in the mountains.
Well, okay. So I also wanted to ask, like, does everyone need to improve their uphill running or riding? Like, I think I have mixed feelings on that. Mm-hmm. Should everyone be thinking about this kind of all of the time, or is this more of a, you should be thinking about it depending on your race? And I'm actually, even now that I said it, I'm thinking, if I look at Sulphur Springs versus Leadville, Sulphur Springs actually has more cumulative climbing. Like it actually is, I think it's over 1,000 meters more climbing than Leadville. But Leadville, you could actually argue, is way harder in terms of climbing because it's several just really long, sustained climbs. Sulphur Springs is just entirely rolling. Mm-hmm. So, you would get ready for both of those kind of differently. Or would you? And like, if I was doing those, or if I was doing then a race that had almost no accumulation, mm-hmm. should I even be thinking about getting better at uphill running?
Well, I think if you were doing something like those 100-mile around the track, or you're a track runner,
just absolutely not.
You're probably not. You might do something for strength. Some coaches will do things like a stride, but like more of a hill that's like 10 seconds and they really focus on, or bounding or something like that. That's like a little more muscular. And so they might do that more for technique or just like strength, which I think is a great thing to do too, like 10-second sort of hill bounds or hill sprints. But yeah, you wouldn't emphasize it as much, right? Your weekends would be different. You'd probably be like practicing flat running or something just to get used to that.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you don't have a race coming up, then yeah, I mean, it makes perfect sense to work on the climbing fitness because it is going to translate. And in running, the other upside of doing the uphill running practice is you're going to also have to come back down. Mm-hmm. And I do think downhill running is probably almost more efficacious than uphill running in terms of, like building up muscle, getting better at like dealing with, fatigue and strain and
sure.
all of that.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's the first couple times you do it, you're going to be quite sore. But then, yeah, that you would wonder that for these, especially these more endurance-based runners, if that's actually like a quick way to get used to more pounding, where that's the question is always like, can you do a 100-mile run if you only do 20-mile runs in preparation? And so that would be some of the stuff that sort of helps get your muscles used to it and your neuromuscular system used to it. But there would be that caution where sometimes you'll have people who just like are always in the mountains or always biking uphill and they become very slow because they're always going very slow. They don't ever have fast running on flats or fast riding with a tailwind where the cadence is up and the speed is up. And so there is a caution that you want to include lots of that stuff so that you don't get slow just from doing slow hills.
For sure. I think the Laguna Beach block worked because I'd been mostly training on flat to that point. Right. I think I did well even at Sulphur because I trained mostly on flat. Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. And so you'll see that too. This is where I think e-bikes are going to be really great for a lot of people where maybe you live in a hilly area or something like that. And so it would try and help cyclists get around this problem where you're maybe you don't want to do hills or work really hard, then you can sort of keep getting that volume. And like I say, the big thing is like, can you ride that much in the week? And if someone's just coming back to the sport or has a lower fitness, lower threshold, then it's tricky because they can never go out and just ride, because they're always working moderately. And so the e-bike might let someone get going, get more consistency, get more frequency, build their volume, and then they might see, oh, the threshold came up, and then maybe they can even ride more analog bikes if they want to, or keep including the e-bike in the training mix. But I think that's going to be something that we see develop. I just had an article go with Canadian Cycling Magazine that should come out here in the summer. I think that's sort of like emerging trends in cycling training with e-bikes, and I think that's like a big thing we're going to see now where from pro to beginner, this is something that if you have access to these e-bikes, I think it's going to be something that really lets people train. And if that makes sense, like if I went out and did tempo or moderate training every day, that would be bad training. But when you're at a lower level, your threshold is lower. It's not a criticism, just your threshold is lower. It is hard because to move forward requires a certain amount. This is in running. This is, well, should you run or should you walk when you're starting running? And everyone says, well, I'm a runner, I should run. But if you can't run without it being moderate effort, well, it could be very hard. You end up burning out, you end up getting tired, you end up with injury because you're always training moderately. It's the cliche of endurance training. And so running, you sort of have to walk, I guess, to start and mix that in, run, walk, and mix walking and hiking into your day. I think that's fine and understood. It's hard to do, but understood. And then for biking, though, I think this is where the e-bike might be a great tool.
Coming back to our budget-friendly.
Yes, you need a smart trainer, a bicycle, several bicycles. One is motorized. It costs a lot.
You're not getting an e-bike, Glassford. You're not getting an e-bike.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, last part on that is you just mentioned smart trainers. So talk to me about does climbing on a smart trainer actually, and I'm putting climbing in quotation marks.
Right, virtual climbing.
Whether we're talking about you're actually bumping your bike up. I know, they actually have now things that will automatically adjust and tilt your bike up.
Right. Yeah, we used to use textbooks under the front wheel, and
now
you have this thing.
It's the best use for textbooks, by the way. It really made you feel like you got your money's worth. When you're done in college, you've finished that class. Okay, it just goes under the front wheel.
I have a hard time with the virtual climbing and virtual distance. I still don't feel like it should count the same as the outdoor, but it does in some cases. And so I think for sure, do that. I think if your indoor training is during the week because you're busy or you can only train at night or whatever the situation is, then for sure. But I think what I see is people they'll use the virtual environments, but they'll never go to the hilly ones because they don't like climbing and it gets muscular. So I would still do exactly what we were saying, where one day has more climbing. Maybe you're trying to climb 1,000 meters, 1,200 meters. It comes a little easier usually in these virtual things because you can just ride up virtual ice mountain and training peaks, and then it's like Alp to Zwift and Zwift. But I think I would use those and embrace those, at least for the mindset. Whether you change your position, I'm not convinced, but that's what they used to do with the textbooks. So there's probably some wisdom to raising the front wheel a little bit if you want to. And then I would do something like a hill interval once a week as well in the middle of the week. And that's probably good training practice. If you're not doing it outside, you don't have access to hills. The people in Florida I work with often will do something like this. We'll put the textbooks under the thing and you'll do some hill intervals. I think that's a good thing. And I do see that same trend where you look at the total ascent someone is doing in the week. This is what we did a Leadville webinar, and I laid out that when you're getting ready for Leadville, we should start seeing that your weekly ascent is getting bigger. You should be doing more climbing across the week because you're getting fitter and you're going to more hilly areas. 2 to 3 times a week, you're going to hills, some for hard intervals, some for long accumulation type moderate workouts. And so I said maybe Leadville's 3,800 meters, 100 meters. Does that make sense? 3,800 meters. So maybe something like that. Weeks that are getting 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 meters of climbing across the week, which is a lot. It doesn't sound like a lot because you're talking about 7 days, but it is a lot when you're working and you have to go actually do that in 5 workouts or 6 workouts. It's enough. And so when you're doing virtual, what I see is people don't climb very much, even virtually. They are always on the flats or London crit. Most people when they ride on Zwift do London, I think, or one of these routes that are pretty flat crit loops. So I always say, well, could you go explore the virtual environment and go to some of these mountains for that moderate weekend workout, and then something that's a little spicy that is a good hill for the midweek workout and actually do the intervals like you would do outdoors in a virtual environment. It's so odd. I keep saying this, but I still keep seeing people with the erg mode and the route choice not matching the workout. But it strikes me as the main benefit of having a virtual screen is that you are virtually riding. And so trying to embrace that if you are trying to get better than climbing, that should be very beneficial.
Perfect. Okay, next question here is how to mountain bike when it's wet out. This is a great question. I think we've covered it before, but it's always worth kind of bringing back up because, I mean, it is a tricky one because you kind of have like two issues here. Number one being, race day may be wet. Like it might be pouring rain on race day. We see it all the time. So it does make sense to be able to learn how to ride on wet trails. But you're not supposed to ride on wet trails for the most part.
Yeah.
Or at least, not on like basically any trail where if you ride over it when it's wet, you're leaving a tire track mark, I think is like the rule of thumb.
Yeah. If you leave tracks, go back or something. If you see a track, go back. Yeah.
Yeah, whatever. That old chestnut.
So it used to be that people didn't care as much. There wasn't social media, so people would just train when it was wet.
Well, there were also less people on the trails back,
yeah, that's fair.
20, 25 years ago. Like you probably only had, on our local trails, you probably had like 10 dudes.
Who would even go out when it's wet.
Who would go out when it was wet.
Right.
And now you have a few hundred who are, who would probably go out and train in the rain.
For sure. And just the general wear to tear. And maybe I think there's also just a bit more knowledge of it, but also the communication of it and the organization of it. There just wasn't any organized clubs in a lot of these places that would ever care or say like, hey, you left a bunch of tracks. It was just sort of what was like, it's like a tree falling in the woods. It's a mountain bike tire running across muddy trails in the woods.
Right.
So what do you do? Well, we go back to consistency is one of the biggest things, and endurance is beneficial. So you can always just hop on the trainer and do 45 minutes of zone 2, or go on your road bike and do 45 minutes to 90 minutes of zone 2. That would be sort of the primary thing. If you have a workout, let's say it was 5x2 minute hill intervals on your mountain bike, you could do 5x2 minutes on a paved road or a gravel hill or whatever is around you. Some people have crushed gravel hills that are appropriate or terrain that's appropriate. So if you can replicate the workout, we say one of our 3 tenets is 80% is a passing grade. So it's not mountain biking, but it's still 5x2 and the intensity's about right. And I'm on my mountain bike. That sounds pretty damn close. And if you look at most mountain bike races, the critical moments are often on crushed gravel paths or double track climb or even a road climb. If you look at, even just watch the World Cups, like there's still so much of them now are like that. And a lot of these marathon races are like that too. There's big sections and big climbs that are roads or similar. So not a big deal. I think if you can keep close to it, but when in doubt, just ride endurance, I think would be the go-to there. The other options would be to look, sometimes you can drive if you have the time available. If there's a sandy destination, we have one very close where I grew up riding that rides fine in the rain, and they're completely fine with you riding in most rain conditions. So if you can go do it that way, that would be a great way to solve it. And then probably the other thing would be to just to try and look ahead and plan your week, where you might have to talk to your coach and say, okay, it looks like it's just going to be horrible on Friday, so probably I can't access the trail Saturday, but what do you think about doing these intervals a day early before the rain on Friday, or on Sunday? Do you think I could do it, but do endurance on Saturday? Like, what do you think that's possible with the training we have in and the goals of the week? So that would be the other thing, is to try and plan ahead and then consider that sort of swap or switch, which is always dangerous, that you're sort of changing what the intention was. If you do it on a Sunday, sometimes you're tired, so it doesn't work out quite as well as you hope, but often it's okay as a one-off. So that would be the other thing, is just some days you just swap the workouts.
And that's especially important if you are newer to mountain biking and like you just don't have the technical skills and stuff, and you're trying to, increase them. Like time on trail really does matter. You could get away with not riding on mountain bike trails for like 2 months and go into a mountain bike race and be totally fine.
Right.
I would be off the back, like at the start.
Sure. And that's a great way to look at it, is how important is this session? Like, and then you would try and protect that session. If the technical skills are the big thing, then you'd want to try and get that in rather than skip it. So then, trying to either plan ahead or pivot so that you do get back on that mountain bike sooner would be a great thought. But then for other people, it might be that the intensity is more important, or even just so many people, it's the frequency again. So it's, the biggest thing is doing something, and that's our other tenet, is 90% of life is showing up. And so showing up isn't just going through the motions, but it sort of is just like, is your butt in the saddle for 5 or 6 days a week? It solves a lot. Like a lot of people, that's the challenge. And it's not easy because a lot of us aren't drawn to exercise. A lot of us have a lot going on in life. So even for want of being on your bike 5 or 6 days, that probably sounds lovely to some people. It just isn't possible. So sometimes we have to work around that and do what we can with what we have.
For sure. And okay, last sort of question on this is, okay, so, someone has trails around them that they can't really ride well in the rain, they can't or ride at all in the rain, but the, race they're trying to get ready for, they know, I'm thinking about like Transylvania Epic, TSE, the, several days of single track racing, often at least one of those days pouring rain. It's a very rocky, rooty course, so you're going to be riding over wet rocks, wet roots. How can someone practice that if they can't really ride their trails in the rain? Like, how would you think about it for them?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's some places in the world where they are okay with it. They've armored the trails, so you could try and get to one of those places as part of like a pre-camp and hope that it rains when that happens. The other things you can do to prepare, thinking through sort of just like a lot of it is fundamental skills and understanding braking. So you could always go to a park in the rain and practice braking on slippery grass, or maybe there's a bit of trails there that aren't bad to ride in the rain. And so you could maybe it's just a short section that you can get to. Where
it's even like, I think a lot of people would even have this in their backyard. They could basically set up a couple like rocks and roots. Like, we're not talking about needing to set up like full on single track, but like if you have a backyard that has a couple trees and maybe some rocks around it, like.
Well, and can you ride gravel and do the same? Like I did a gravel ride here on Saturday, and it was very warm and a lovely day, but we went to some of these places that were near rivers and have river crossings and are just wetter for longer, and there's ATV ruts everywhere, and they're just technically open roads. They're sort of like what we call no winter maintenance roads, or you might call them like sectors or something if you're into gravel racing. So we got lots of mud practice. We were on and off our bike and trying to fight for traction, and did a couple chutes that were really sketchy coming down with very little braking. So even though it was on a really nice day, we sort of sought out wet around rivers and puddles that were just on secondary roads. So that would be the other thing. And then you get a good feedback, even on your gravel bike, of clearance and which tires hook up and what's it like when I slide and how do you brake. That would be stuff I would look at where those are pretty accessible. And if it's an open road, it's an open road, even if it's sort of like a secondary Jeep road. So that would be places you could look for things like these wet routes. But again, a lot of these things come back to our fundamental skills of balance, and can you get your foot out, and can you corner, and can you brake and skid, and can you control a skid? So these are things that you can practice really anytime, but especially in the rain, you could go out to a park or someplace and just play on grass, almost like a cyclocross practice.
Perfect. Okay. Next one, question on the other riding around intervals. So right. This is it's sort of specific to some of your clients with like their training plans, but I think this is like a pretty common thing. Like if I think about my workouts for the week, usually it's, run 3 miles, then here's the workout, like, 10 sets of 1 minute on, 1 minute off, whatever it is.
Right.
And then 3 miles cool down, or 3 miles like
right.
home.
So there's a lot of assumption that you know what you're supposed to do between or in the warm up. Because it's pretty simple. And in coaching, you sort of, at first, I think in coaching, a lot of coaches will put way too much detail in, or maybe at first you do keep it simple. I don't know. I think there's probably like a cycle there where like you try and keep it simple, but then you get too smart for your own good. So then you put in way too much,
right,
too many details. And then you come back to where you started and you sort of just put the key information. And so, yeah, you might do a 10-mile run with 3 by 1 miles in it, but then no details about what you're supposed to do otherwise. And yours comes through in like an Excel spreadsheet. So there's really not a lot of rooms for a lot of other stuff. And so even in my cycling workouts that might have a download file of some type, it's not always like apparent what you should do. And not everyone uses those. And I often say you shouldn't even. So it might be as simple as 3 hours and include 5 by 30-second race pace. But then it's like, well, what do you do around the race pace? And so that's what this question is sort of like, what do you do for recovery, or what do you do for warm up? And so the assumption is just always you're running at an endurance, a low intensity endurance pace, a comfortable pace. Under 75% of max heart rate is what we use, and also a threshold power is what we use. But just easy, low intensity. And so that's sort of just always the assumed thing. You just always resume endurance training between your intervals.
Perfect.
Yeah, I don't know if there's much more to
I
it.
think that's
But you're right.
sums
Yeah,
it
it's
up.
like you almost need to tell people, but then some people miss the notes or the like details, right?
I
And
think
so
most people would make that assumption. However, I guess maybe the other nuance here is like how easy is too easy for like especially for your warm up and cool down. I think between the intervals, it's sort of as easy as you need it to be.
yeah.
I find with running, like often my run is actually still like pretty quick just by nature of, it's not usually long intervals. So like I'm rarely dropping to like lower than my usual endurance pace. I'm usually running faster than my endurance pace just because I'm kind of like primed.
Right.
But then, obviously I kind of know what pace to hit for the warm up and the cool down. But I could see someone going out potentially almost too easy, like coffee ride, recovery ride pace.
Sure.
Rather than like easy endurance. So where do you kind of draw that line?
And
Or is that line?
you're speaking about the recoveries or through the like warm up?
No, more the warm up and the cool down. Because I think like I say, between the intervals, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Like depends on how you feel. And
Right.
like sometimes that might be like, okay, that was like the hardest thing I've ever done. I need really easy.
Yeah. So the assumption is that in a workout like that you would get the work done. So whatever you do so the mistake someone might make is they walk and then they do the intervals, but they don't really do a great job because they weren't really warmed up for the intervals. But most people, that actually probably would be fine if they walked or they really soft pedaled out to the hill and then they did the intervals and then they soft pedal all the way home because they were fatigued from the intervals. Probably wouldn't be bad. And then down the road, this is often the answer is like, could you go and do it? And then we'll see how you solve the workout. And then we can play with it. And we say, okay, well, next week, what happens if you run instead of walking all the way to the hill? Just try jogging. Do you think you can jog to the hill and then see if you can still do the workout? Or if you found, that first interval was a shock to the system, I was walking, then maybe you do a bit of warm-up strides or warm-up sprints on the bike to get ready for that. If it wasn't suggested in the workout to do like some warm-up efforts and sort of practice your pre-race routine. Maybe we start incorporating that. And similar with the recoveries between, maybe if you aren't finishing the workout, then you need to take a bit more walking recoveries. We talked about how some people to run is becoming moderate training for them. So then walking would actually make lots of sense if you're also trying to do intervals, because if you do moderate recoveries, you're going to end up doing moderate intervals. And that's probably not what you're looking for in these. You're looking for quite fast intervals, I presume. And then again, in the cool down, you just go back to endurance pace, but it might be in the bike, especially where you have gears, you might find that your heart rate's up and your perceived exertion is up, but you've actually done quote unquote some damage to the system. So you might actually not push a lot of power after your intervals, and that's okay too. You get yourself home. But then in subsequent weeks, again, this is the power of training, you might find that, I can actually recover my power and my heart rate back to the normal sort of zone 2 range. And what a great sign of endurance. Like you did your intervals and then you recovered and you were able to persist and endure and sort of recover back to your normal state quicker after doing that intensity. So that would be a great sign. And again, if we just do the work and try it a few times, often there's like an answer and like a good enough that we learn just by doing it.
Perfect. Okay, last question is planned TSS. So this is specifically in Training Peaks. It's the training stress score. I feel like to me this is sort of akin to Garmin's productive, not productive, fit, horrifically unfit, garbage person metrics that pop up on your screen every so often.
Yeah, it's an average is the problem. So I often say, like, as an athlete, I wouldn't really look at TSS. There's some coaches like Frank Overden, and they use a lot of it. And there is an option in Training Peaks to plan and do your annual plan based on TSS, which isn't bad. It makes sense. Like, it's fine. I tend to stick with the older way of doing hours in your annual plan and just the focus of the different blocks of the year. So we look at the hours, and then we look at what we were just talking about. What intervals are we doing, and which days are hard and which days are easy, and then what are the total hours goals for the year, the week or the year or the month or whatever. And so we plan based more off hours and sort of the focus of the different phases or the periods or the blocks of the year. The plan TSS sort of in a Training Peaks in the Training Peaks ecosystem. It's just based off of the prescribed duration. So if I put in a 90-minute workout, and then if there is a structured download, it's going to take the averages from all the different sections of that ride and produce a TSS based off of that. So if the warm up is 50 to 70% of threshold, and then you do intervals that are at 100% of threshold, and then you cool down, it's going to take the average of those zones. And so it could be accurate. It could be very close. If you did the workout like to the letter, right in the average of the zones, you'll probably be really close. So people who do smart trainer workouts probably are very close. And so you get into this thing where it's like, it said 76 TSS. I did 76 TSS. But once you go outside, it's going to be much messier. Maybe your workout's shorter, maybe it's longer, maybe you surged, maybe you really eased into the warm up and the cool down, maybe you, whatever, right? Like any variable amount of things could happen. So you'll see people say, oh, today was only 56 TSS and I had 76. But the question is ultimately like, did you do what was suggested? And so I often say, look at the title of the workout. It says 3 by 10 minutes, 90-minute ride, something like that. That's the mission for the athlete. And then that TSS, I think over time is going to just sort of like go in the right direction if you're following the training plan otherwise. Like if it's a 3-hour ride and you do a 3-hour ride, it's mostly going to go in the right direction. We'd want to be careful that you're like pushing the intensity up artificially to try and get the TSS, because this is where you get people, again, training moderately to try and hit this random metric that isn't really reflecting. It's this like combined metric that can get dangerous if you're trying to like push the intensity up when it's not meant to be pushed.
So this all comes back to the no one metric should be your primary driver for training, whether that's mileage, HRV, TSS, productivity, whatever number.
Well, and if you remember Marco Altini, our friend from HRV for Training, he said like his big thing was these, what did he call them? Like the combined metrics, things where they take a bunch of things to put like what was his word for it? Not accumulate, which I still can't say that word. They would like when they have those recovery scores.
How many of the scores? Basically.
Yeah. So that's like multiple things, multiple factors. They're trying to give you a number out of 100 for how recovered you are. But he said those are super dangerous because what gets weighted how, and is that how we would want those scores weighted? And then what does that mean if the score gets pulled down? So he had, that is a great episode if you go back and listen to our episode with Marco. But I think that's what TSS is also, is this combined metric where you don't know, is it volume or intensity pushing that to 100? There's lots of ways to get 100 TSS in a workout. So you want to be careful, because if the athlete just, that's the thing they're staring at, again, they might do a 1-hour TT to get 100 TSS, but someone else might do a 3-hour low zone 2 ride to get 100 TSS. And those are two different people, two different stimulus, right?
Right.
Yeah. So you want to be careful.
Perfect. All right. Well, that wraps it up for today. Again, you can head over to the show notes to grab our anonymous question form if you have more questions for us, or shoot us a DM over at Consummate Athlete. I'm at Molly J. Herford. Peter is at Peter Glassford over on the Instagram, or head to consummateathlete.com for show notes plus tons of other articles, information, etc. All right. Happy training. We'll see you next week. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Consummate Athlete Podcast. If you want to hear more training, racing, and endurance sport advice, make sure you subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating and review. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at consummateathlete.com for a weekly dose of inspiration and advice straight to your inbox.